The honourable member for Halliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I am pleased to rise and speak about Bill C-8, a piece of legislation that will add an additional approximate $70 billion of new spending to this federal budget. And before I really get into the meat of what I want to say, I would like to let you know that I'm sharing my time with the honourable member from Kenora, who's just right beside me and anxious to get going. So, Speaker, let's talk about the national debt before we really get into it. Right now, it's hitting a jaw-dropping $1.2 trillion. And at the start of the pandemic, the government brought in $176 million in new spending unrelated to COVID. And we have said this many times in the House, I know I have. There's a significant chunk, a third of this new spending, that was couched in the language of COVID, but yet had absolutely nothing to do with COVID, and we saw what happened. The government used this as an opportunity to reward its friends and punish its enemies. Did you do that? I did do that. Thank you, member. Let's look at housing, Speaker. I think this is most important because I think everyone is actually looking at this with a very serious lens, especially those on the lower side of the income level. Last year, home inflation hit 25%. The Real Estate Association chief economist called it the biggest gain of all time. So what happened? $400 billion of new money was put into the atmosphere, into the financial markets, and much of it was lent out, and it caused a massive bubble. So when the Prime Minister took power, the average home was $435,000. Now it's $810,000. I'm going to give a couple of examples from my hometown. So in the town of Lindsay, actually this is from Bobcaygeon, I'll do that first. In the village of Bobcaygeon in 2014, this house was listed for $465,900. It sold for $455,000, so below asking in 2014. Now, just last month, it sold for $1.9 million. It was actually listed for $1.8 million. This house in Lindsay, new build, is a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2018, $390,000. In 2018, $319,000. Sold last month, January 19th, for $1.1 million. It was actually listed, Speaker, for $886,000. Now, the village in which this is in, the town, I should say, is Lindsay, so it's about 20,000 people. $1.1 million. And the government continues to turn a blind eye to this. What's their answer to this, Speaker? It's more new spending. Well, let's have another government program. That will inevitably fail, and they'll come up with another government program to fix the problem they created in the first place. What we need to transition to is more of an economy that talks about building things, getting our economy back on track, opening up where possible. And the government failed on that as well. We had a situation at the beginning of the pandemic where vaccines were coming online. And what did the government do? It put all its eggs into the Cancino basket. And of course, we all know how that failed. Then the government had to get in line behind a whole slew of other countries trying to get vaccines into this country. But even before that, Speaker, we here on the opposition benches were talking about different pieces to the puzzle that can aid in this fight, one of which was rapid tests. And I remember right at the beginning when we were saying, as the opposition, look, government, we should be looking at this as a viable piece of the puzzle until we can figure out the next steps. And the Liberals basically turned their eye to us. They didn't want to have this conversation. Those are two main areas where they failed. And now, because they refuse to listen to anyone that might have another solution to their vision, they shun them. There are people all across this country who are frustrated, who are angry. I think we all are. I think we're all done with this pandemic. We should be talking about how we move to the next stage. But the Prime Minister refuses to say so. And in my question just a moment ago, Speaker, I asked the member from Kingston about relaxing some of these travel restrictions. Restrictions that many in the industry, including the experts that member mentioned, are calling for some of these regulations to be relaxed, including those that specifically focus on vaccinated individuals. And the travel and tourism industry have been the industries that have been most hurt by this, because the government refuses to actually move on these files. We heard in question period yesterday the Prime Minister saying that he is not going to budge on this issue. But yet countries around the world are starting to relax some of their restrictions, realizing that we need to learn to live with this virus as best we can, as safely and as responsibly as we can. But we continue to be one of the most locked down countries. There are ways through this, Speaker. There are ways around this, that we can start opening up and living again, seeing our families again, not having to watch a loved one die through an iPad. There are solutions. The government just needs to accept some of them and listen to the experts that are saying, yes, there are ways forward. The Liberals also talk a lot about Main Street. They always talk about Main Street, which is important. And we, as the Conservatives, had a very robust plan in our election platform to get people off their computers and back onto our main streets. But the only thing that is going well is Bay Street, because of those failures that I mentioned just a few moments ago. So who are the Liberals really in it for? I don't think it's the person living in that small town of Lindsay that now has to pay $1.1 million for a house just 4 years ago that was $390,000. Let's get our economy back on track, Speaker. Let's start to reopen and have a serious conversation about reopening and getting things. And yes, most of it's in provincial jurisdiction. We now see the province of Saskatchewan moving towards that, and others will follow. But this federal government also has to play a meaningful role in that conversation, which it seems to be absent about, especially around international borders. Let's get the travel and tourism industry back on track. We can do that safely. We know that. Other countries have done it. But there just doesn't seem to be any movement, and that is sad. So if you really want to help the disenfranchised in our community, economic activity is where we need to go. And we've seen here in Ontario, manufacturing leave at an alarming pace. And that happened during the 15 years of rule in Ontario in which the Liberal Party was in power. They made electricity prices some of the highest in North America. And who relies on electricity the most? Manufacturing. And we pushed all of that out. And when the pandemic hit, what did we realize we needed most? Manufacturing. So we put ourselves at a disadvantage. Even our energy industry. We have watched over the last 6 years this Liberal government put in regulation, red tape, policy that shut down our energy industry, while at the same time promoting bad actors around the world. One example that the government didn't even fight on was the cancellation of Keystone XL. That was one thing President Biden did when he got into office first. The second one was to release the sanctions on the completion of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which allowed Russia to provide energy to Germany, one of the biggest economic powers in Europe. And now we have an incursion paid for in large part by this newfound wealth the Russian superpower now has, because it's now powering Germany. Why couldn't we fill that gap with Canadian energy? Because we can't seem to get anything built in this country. So let's start focusing on what we need to do. Strengthening our economy, creating jobs, opportunity, wealth, attracting the brains here, allowing them to innovate, create new things, including green technology. But we can't do that when nobody has the ability to get off their feet. And that is the result of the government continuing to put their boot on the neck of the economy. So I thank you, Speaker, and I always say, remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Queen's Privy Council and for Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And I stand again with a very heavy heart, as I did a few days ago, speaking on behalf of my constituents who are going through just an incredibly terrible time right now because of these unpeaceful protests that are taking place in the residential streets of downtown Ottawa. And Speaker, I have to say I was so disappointed to see the members of the official party, the Conservative members, standing outside, cheering these protesters who are taking the peace away from people who live in this community. Speaker, I'm going to very quickly read an email that I received from one of my constituents, and she wrote that I'm again horrified seeing our holy Jewish Star of David sported on jackets decorated by anti-vaxxers, which along with the swastikas on flags is terrifying for me and unspeakable for anyone who cares. Speaker, let's give them back peace and end this protest. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I've said many times there were the acts, some of which the member just outlined there, that have to be dealt with, and those individuals have to be held responsible for those actions. And if criminal charges are necessary, they should be charged criminally, and the law should be enforced, and we support that. But the member opposite also completely ignores how we actually got to this point. There are people who are taking time and money out of their own lives to travel across the country in some cases, just to try to get the government to listen to them. And these are people all walks of life, of all backgrounds, that just feel this government has left them behind, that has no care in the world for them. And that's unfortunate, because they have a valid argument. And yes, there are people that need to be called out for their wrong actions, but to ignore the message that's being sent, I think, is actually a failure on the government's part.
Questions et commentaires.